Okay, I'm going to try to run through this real quick. This is chapter 11. This has to do with food needs for human populations and also ways that human beings have devised ways to combat hunger and also maximize land usage. All right, here we go. All right, so we're going to look at human nutritional requirements, and this is going to get into human health later on in the year. We get to like chapter 17, 18 or so. And we're going to look at nutritional requirements not being met by various parts of the world. And this is interesting because it doesn't always mean they're lacking in the actual number of calories. It could just be that the calories they are getting don't have good enough nutritional content. All right, so these definitions right here, you need to know like the back of your hand. Under nutrition, whenever you see that, you should think calories, okay? So you're not getting enough calories, and that's why you have undernutrition. Malnourishment, on the other hand, means that you could be getting the right amount of calories, but you're not getting the correct balance of proteins, carbs, vitamins, and minerals, right? Just keep that in mind. These are places like developed nations could also have this if we have some parts of our population don't get the correct types of nutritional content out of their food, right? So we could end up with lots of obesity and still not have the correct nutritional balances. Food security is when people have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets their dietary needs for an active and healthy lifestyle. And you can kind of go back to human populations back in the day, a few chapters ago, and think about which levels of development are necessary to have consistent food security, right? Food insecurity, on the other hand, is basically just the exact opposite. All right, and so you don't have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets dietary needs. It just is a condition which people do not have access to. They do not have access to food. All right, so let's take a look at this chart real quick. So human nutritional needs. So we are seeing a decline of undernourished people in the world, but it's still greater than what we would like, as by the World Food Summit. Okay, it's going down. You can kind of think of some reasons why. As economies get better, they're able to access better quality food, and also maybe the rise of GMOs in different parts of the world, where they're enriching things like golden corn in order to kind of increase the nutritional content of things like our simple carbohydrate rices, right? So white rice by itself is not necessarily a very nutritious thing to eat, but it is a carb that does kind of get the job done and at least takes care of calories. But remember, if you have a really high diet of something like rice or certain types of corn, it's very possible that you might be meeting your caloric needs. You wouldn't be undernourished, but you might be malnourished, right? All right, famine is a condition in which food insecurity is so extreme that large numbers of death occur in a given area over a relatively short period of time. And you can kind of think of some countries in the world. Some of you all might have countries that you're researching this year that have famine, right? So kind of think about that. All right, anemia, you need to know, is a deficiency of iron. And you get this from things like meats, and some beans and things like that, so legumes. So knowing like how to increase the intake of these things could be beneficial to your understanding of APES and maybe on the AP exam, but I haven't seen too many things like this, right? You're more likely to see where you're expected to know the effects of deficiencies by looking at pollution and how it might block your pathways in your body to synthesize things like iron. But for now, just it's good to know either way. Okay, overnutrition, too many calories, and a lack of balance of food and nutrients. So this is kind of an overarching term, whereas undernutrition and malnutrition on the negative side, the much more negative side, kind of split that idea of not enough calories versus not the right balance of nutrients. So overnutrition kind of encompasses both of those. Meat, livestock, or poultry consumed as food. And it's important to know that in the context of the types of countries that we have, we are one of the greatest consumers here in America of meat, and we know that when you think meat, you should think increase in footprint. And why is that? Because it takes lots of H2O, which has to be transported. It takes fossil fuels, and it takes land, right? It takes lots of land area, right, in order to process that stuff. So meat has a gigantic impact, and obviously, as you go from poultry to livestock, as you go this way, the impact goes way up, right? And you remember that equation we learned earlier in the year, the IPAT equation? IPAT equation, right? Yeah, population population, affluence, technology, right? And all that goes into the impact that we have on the planet. So you need to know this idea too, and always be thinking about how the things that we do here in the United States or wherever we are in the world contribute to our impact. Humans eat a variety of foods, but grains, corn, rice, and wheat make up the largest portion of the human diet. This is important. Grains are the greatest proportion of the human diet worldwide. Okay, there are 50,000 edible plants, but 3 species, corn, rice, and wheat, constitute 60% of the human energy intake. These, in general, have really high energy per unit, right? And that's why we like those, right? They were selectively bred that way before we were able to do GMOs. Meat is the second largest component of the human diet. For some of us, it's a bit more than that, right? If we're lucky. Okay, human nutritional needs. Here's the per capita meat consumptions through 2012. It's begun to decrease in the United States, mostly because I think a lot of us are broke. But it is a good idea that we use less of our land for the production of meat products that we eat. And of course, that's easy to say when we're in a country when we have lots of alternatives to meat products to get our protein and to get our nutrients and minerals, right? If you're in a developing country where I have to eat that chicken, I have to eat that cow, they're definitely having very different ecological debates and arguments over how best to utilize their land. And remember that if you live somewhere like in a rainforest and your population is increasing, so as your population increases, obviously you need to increase the amount of food production. And if you're in a rainforest, there isn't a lot of grazing land, so what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to increase the cutting of trees, right? And we know that this is kind of like a vicious cycle, right? This is kind of a positive feedback loop. Because as you cut the trees, what happens? Well, erosion goes way up. Right? Erosion goes up, the minerals go down, and what do you have to do again? It leads you to more cutting, right? And that's going to lead to erosion, which leads to more cutting. And so as the population increases, it kind of leads into this positive feedback loop, right? Where you're able to now sustain your population because you've clear cut and made farmland. And the population goes up, so what do you have to do? It's all kind of feeding back into this thing. And because you can feed more, your population goes up. I could do this for hours, right? Positive feedback loop. Undernutrition and malnutrition occur primarily because of poverty, right? And whether we're in the United States or elsewhere, you tend to have a poor diet the less money you have, because you have to get things that are easy, right? You have to get things that are easy. This is why government outreach programs like the Michelle Obama kind of have been good. We have seen decreases in child obesity in the last decade, right around the time Michelle Obama put out her healthy food plan for the United States and kind of acting and living more fit. Those sort of things are things that we can do on a governmental level. You don't have to ban fatty foods, although some countries do kind of ban the use of things like trans fats. So you can do that on a governmental level, where you require food companies to put the caloric intake and the dietary nutritional content information on the packaging of food. That's something that can lead to a decrease. Even if you don't have the most money in the world, it can lead to a decrease in the rates of malnutrition and obesity. But most of the time, PSA and government outreach are also very helpful as well. So those are some options you have if you're ever asked to list and describe 2 ways to decrease malnutrition in a country, or if they say practical ways for a very poor industrializing country, how they can reduce their malnutrition rates and obesity. And you can always say that education is a good idea. All right, here's some more reasons for malnutrition. World grain supply, days of supply for everyone in the world, has been declining. All right. So now we're going to look at ways that we try to deal with the problem of large populations and limited land resources. So we're going to look at large-scale agricultural methods, and I want you to think here your Food Inc. stuff. I kind of want you to think about some of the things you saw in there. For better or worse, those are all ways that we try to deal with large populations and feeding the world, right? All right, we're going to look at the benefits and consequences of GMOs and discuss large-scale raising of meat and fish. All right, industrial agriculture applies techniques of mechanization and standardization, known as agribusiness or agrobusiness. This is going to lead to what we called in the textbook as the Green Revolution. Right, and that's everything that has to do with corporate agriculture. Okay, whether that's inorganic pesticides, whether that's the production of GMOs, whether that's the use of large-scale irrigation, large-scale harvesting machinery, all those things go into this idea of the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is essentially looking at trying to maximize the production, so maximize production for as many people as possible, right? So this is not green as in go green and think green. So I want you to make sure you don't confuse this. All right, energy subsidy, we talked about this. It's the energy you got to put in per calorie of food produced, right? And most of the time, it's going to be in the way of fossil fuels, and that's why our CO2 goes up when we produce agriculture, especially meats, and even more especially cattle, right? So cattle have a really, really big energy subsidy. It may take 20 grains of wheat to make 1 kilogram of beef, and it's even crazier when you think about the amount of water that goes into it, right? So try to go back and look at how many liters of water it takes per kilogram. I think it was, I want to say like 11 gallons of water per kilogram of wheat, and it's like 44 gallons of water per kilogram of cattle. So that's something that's really, really crazy, right? Okay, most energy subsidies in modern agriculture in the form of fossil fuels to produce fertilizers. And we talked about that earlier when you explode CO2 and methane in particular. When you explode this in the presence of oxygen, there happens to be this also hanging out. So you end up getting a bunch of other products, but I'm just going to simplify it to N2O. And this is nitrous oxide. And this is a potent greenhouse gas, GHG. And it also does ozone, which will lead to photochemical smog. Not smog the dragon, smog, the stuff you don't like to breathe. And that's depletes ozone, right? So you get bad ozone, or you get bad ozone in the troposphere, and that's bad. All right, transporting food from your farm to your plate is another large energy subsidy, right? And that's CO2 emissions. All right, so you need to kind of see like our relative energy subsidy here between all the different things here. You see that fishing is a really, really big sink of our energy, right? It's not very good. Energy input per calorie of food obtained is greater for modern agricultural practice than for traditional agriculture. Why is that? Because we're doing it on large scales and shipping it all over the planet. And when you're doing things on an industrial level, you want to do it fast, right? So you need to think you're decreasing your time, right? So you want to decrease your time, so you want to have the speed at which you're producing go way up. So a better way to do that in a quicker level is to use things like inorganic fertilizers, because these things, they infiltrate into the soil very, very quickly. They don't need to be broken down. They do not need to be broken down by little creepy critters in the ground and undergo like decomposition, like things like cow poop. These are going to be organic fertilizers, right? These take a little bit more time to break down, right? So the speed at which you are producing stuff goes down if you're on small scales and you're using organic things. What this also decreases, though, a lot of the times is your potential for runoff. And we know that runoff of fertilizers leads to this guy, eutrophication, right? Which can lead to algal blooms, right? Which lead to hypoxic conditions, so your O2 in the water, your dissolved oxygen goes way down, right? So these are all things you kind of need to remember and try to associate with things like fossil fuels and fertilizers and things like that. Okay, so let's kind of keep looking at this guy right here, small scale corn. So you notice that when we start doing small scale, your energy subsidy goes down, right? Because you're not having to use gigantic machinery to do it. You're not having to ship it way out of town. Eating locally is really good because you are decreasing your energy subsidy, right? So make sure you kind of look at this and be able to rank things if you're ever given on a test. Like, what are a few practical ways that we can reduce the energy subsidy or fossil fuel consumption using in terms of our food, right? All right, the Green Revolution, so let's talk about that again. Mechanization and fertilization, irrigation, improved crop varieties. It's increased food production dramatically. So this right here is a pro of the green revolution. Okay, so our food production has gone way up. Okay, the abundance of food supplied by agriculture is one factor that has led to exponential growth of the human population. And you remember what that looked like, right? Human population, this is logistical growth curve. Logistical growth curve, right? And in the presence of some carrying capacity, if like we did not have the green revolution, what would you expect this curve to look like? Not exponential, but sinusoidal, right? And we would be approaching the carrying capacity, right? And this is where we get our idea of a K-select species, something that lives on the brink of the carrying capacity all the time, and it doesn't like to go over like an R species would. An R species would do something much more like this all the time, tries to do that, overshoots and die-offs. All right, the Green Revolution, a shift in agricultural practices in the 20th century that included blah, 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 irrigation, improved crop varieties in the way of GMOs and artificially selected crops through selective breeding, and resulted in increased food output. So this right here, do not forget it, is the exam question on what the Green Revolution is. Agribusiness. Okay, so let's look at the problems. Okay, certain problems including waterlogging and salinization. And you also need to remember that with a lot of our irrigation practices, if it's not done really well, right, if we don't do things like drip irrigation, like selected spray irrigation, you can end up with a lot of really bad, again, runoff. And this is definitely exacerbated by inorganic nitrogenous fertilizers. Inorganic fertilizers compounded with industrial irrigation means that you end up with a lot of runoff and cultural eutrophication, or anthropocentric, right, human-based. Okay, waterlogging can lead to soil degradation because what's happening is you are moving the minerals that would normally stay there. Remember how we tested for all those minerals? The nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus, sorry. That's what I meant. All right, and and because you're keeping the water there for a long time, you end up not only killing the bacteria there and getting rid of the air, so the O2 also goes way down. Because remember, the secret ingredient in soil is O2 and also bacteria. You're killing off those things. You're taking away the air from the roots, and you're also making these things run off. All right, and when you get evaporation, you get salinization on the surface, and the only way to really remediate that is to really add more soil. And that's really tough because soil weighs a crap ton. If you remember David D coming in with 4 tons of soil, it's really hard to move all that stuff. Imagine that for an entire farm, right? So just David will never forget that. All right, let's look at irrigation. Let's look at how the process actually works for salination and waterlogging. Okay, since water has a lower evaporation point than sodium, guess what's going to happen? It's going to evaporate, but the salts are going to remain there. And over time, that leads to this nice layer of salt in the soil. All right, and then here we have waterlogged soil. Salt concentrates eventually increase to levels that are toxic to plants. And I'd like us to do when we get to poisons and pesticides and lethal doses, I would like to do an experiment with salts and kind of see like when a population of plants will stop growing or when half of them will stop growing. And that's called the LD50. Just kind of introducing that now. The LD50, the lethal dose, 50% is when the effective rate of 50% of them would stop living if exposed to that amount. Okay, Green Revolution fertilizers. So let's look at organic or synthetic or inorganic. Composed of organic matter from plants and animals is when you have organic. So this is mostly just poops and also biomass, other types of biomass. And a really good one for nitrogen is going to be like plant matter, like grass and stuff like that, right? All right, synthetic fertilizer, commercially, normally with the use of fossil fuels, also known as inorganic fertilizer. And again, I'm going to hit this. When you explode fossil fuels to make nitrogen fertilizers, you end up also creating like N2O and stuff like that. All right, monocropping for pesticides. You get a large number of plantlings for single species or varieties, and this affects the local area with biodiversity. The biodiversity goes down if you have a monocrop in the area. because you're obviously just allowing one plant to exist in the area. But how would that affect everything else around it, though? Well, if there are certain bugs that rely on a variety of plants to be able to survive and pollinate and get their food from, and you only have one crop around, one, they might not be able to eat from that plant, and two, when you pull them all out of the ground, what have you done? You've destroyed their ability to eat. So that's a couple of the problems with monocropping. Another problem in terms of soil degradation with monocropping is that when you pull all those plants out at the same time, you get rid of all the roots, right? All the roots are gone. And if the roots are gone, what happens to the soil stability? The stability of the soil goes down, and what ends up happening? Your ability for erosion to occur goes way up. And guess what? It's another one of those positive feedback loops, right? Okay, so that's one of the problems with monocropping. And also diseases, right? If a disease sweeps through and this plant is not adjusted or does not have a resistance to that, they all get killed at the same time. All right, pesticides, a substance either natural or synthetic that kills or controls organisms that people consider pests. And there are two types that you need to know. You need to know the persistent and the non-persistent, right? And those are the ones that will not stay in the ground for a long time but have to be applied more often. And each one of these has human health effects and consequences. Insecticides kill bugs and invertebrates. And yes, invertebrates mean bugs, animals. They're not plants. I know somebody said, like, well, a plant doesn't have a spine. I'm like, all right, well, most of my watermelons are boneless, but that's not what we're talking about. Herbicides are for the purpose of getting rid of plant species like weeds and stuff like that. And something that you need to know in terms of being more mindful about pesticides we put on the ground that could run off and get into the water table and things like that is this idea of targeted use. So being very targeted in our use of pesticides is a way to kind of help save the environment. And also this idea of integrated pest management, where we're using things like bugs that naturally are in the area to take care of pests. What you definitely do not want to do is introduce invasives like the cane toad and things like that. You don't want to pull in things that are from other places to help take care of your pest problem if you can help it. All right, so let's talk about pesticides again. Some more. So here we go with the selective broad spectrum pesticides. Selective pesticides, persistent pesticides, and non-persistent pesticides. So you need to see, you need to know the difference between those, and all of these have uses that can be used on FRQs and things like that. So which one of these do you think would have the greatest effect ecologically on the environment? You could make an argument that it would be the broad spectrum, but it really depends on the situation. Is it a persistent broad spectrum? Is it non-persistent? A selective pesticide could be probably, in my opinion, more dangerous in some cases if it's incredibly persistent and the biodiversity is really low. So you have to kind of like weigh those things. It's very important to do those things that we did with Shannon's Index a few chapters ago and look at the biodiversity there and do an array of tests such as LD50 to kind of see what type of pesticide to go with, if any at all. A lot of the times, if you just grow different crops next to each other, like you do this idea of intercropping, you can reduce the amount of pesticides you would need to use because those pests are not going to be as attracted to an area that just has their favorite food, right? If you mix it up and put like, let's say, cell hates Brussels sprouts. Well, if I don't want cell bugs to eat all my corn because cell loves corn, I'm going to put a bunch of Brussels sprout a Brussels sprout border around all my corn, right? Each one's going to be flanked by a bunch of Brussels sprouts. It's just going to be Brussels sprouts and corn all over the place, and it won't be as an attractive of an area for cell to want to get her grubbage on, right? All right, pesticide resistant, a trait possessed by certain individuals that are exposed to pesticides and survive. Now, their offspring are going to have that gene, and it's going to exist in a higher rate than it did before, right? So if the offspring that are resistant go up, guess what happens? The resistance goes way up. And then what's going to happen? They're not going to die, get more offspring, and oh, look at that. We end up with another one of these positive loops, right? All right, and this is what we call a pesticide treadmill. Okay, so pest resistance, and then pesticide development, and then guess what? The pesticide gets a little bit stronger. So then the pests that survive are also stronger. And we get this in human health conditions as well with antibiotic resistance. So it's kind of a similar kind of problem where if you don't finish your antibiotics all the way, any surviving bacteria will probably survive that bout of antibiotics that you give to them again in the future. All right, so this is one of the issues we face with human health right now. All right, so here we go. Here's that loop we were talking about. Make sure you know this is the pesticide treadmill. All right, and we will talk about GMOs in the next one.